Welcome back to Tune It Over. Hope my fancy intro's working again. I'm enjoying that. It's a bit loud though. It comes in hot. But yeah, welcome back. I said I'd have some stats for you this time. We've done a week's worth of these as of yesterday, and so is it worthwhile? Well, I'm enjoying it. I get to speak to some of my favourite people, and they might not get on the phone to me, but if I said I'm broadcasting it, they seem to be joining me, which is great. And I've got a great guest for you. Of course, you might have noticed in the titles for you today. But yeah, about between 20 and 30 people tuning live fairly consistently, which is great, and not all the same faces. But then it gets about 1,000 views a day, which is brilliant, across different channels, and not all of them listening to the whole thing and stuff, but people visiting it after the fact seem to have a bit of a theme where people will visit about 15-20 minutes and then catch up on the rest of it afterwards. But yeah, I'm happy with that. It just feels like we can touch on things that are current and things that are topical. And this is a great example of that. My good friend Ian Griffiths is going to join me in a second and to talk about something that is very current in and around the podiatry sphere, of which is, of course, what I consider a leading expert in this field. I disagree with that, no doubt. He's a very, very humble man, but it's been contentious, and we want to talk about that a little bit and chew that over. We'll touch on some stuff, other sort of spats that have gone on Twitter recently as well at the end, which will be interesting, because I definitely want to get into that, stuck into biomechanics and form a little bit later. Try and see if I can bait Ian's opinion on that. So without further ado, let's see if I can bring him in smoothly. It rarely goes smoothly, but that looks fairly tidy. Ian, can you hear us?
I can, Jack. Can you hear me?
Fantastic. Can do. Yes, absolutely. Now, you should need no introduction. And if anyone did not know of you, I can't help but encourage them because our time's short. I'm just going to say, just go and look him up and you'll be in for a treat. Or, of course, listen to your infamous podcast on Physio Matters. However, what I've got you on today to talk about is that there was a bit of a storm kicked up by some research that was published in BJSM last week. And without me giving it too much of a framing or even being seen to spin it from here, I was wondering if you can walk us through what's happened and then we'll start adding some meat on the bones.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bringing me on. It's exciting. We are referring to the paper, and forgive me if I keep glancing, because it's fairly new. I've had to make some notes. I've only had 2 or 3 runs through it myself, but we're looking at the paper by Nadine Rasenberg and colleagues in the BJSM, which essentially looks at different care for plantar heel pain in the sort of Dutch primary care setting. And the fascination here was twofold for me. It was firstly what the paper showed, which we'll come on to talk about, then somehow translated into what I saw being tweeted and the sort of the clinicians' sort of interpretations and take homes, which I think is fascinating. But as you know, because I know we've spoken about this, there was an extra bit of interest whereby it's the first time that I can recall that a paper was published, and pretty much on the same day in the same journal, an editorial was published about that paper from a different group of researchers, sort of bringing up some things, some limitations, some things that needed to be taken into context. And this editorial was commissioned by the BJSM as well. And I just can't think of a time that's ever happened. What used to happen is a paper would be published, and then perhaps a month later or in the next edition, you'd get a sort of letter to the editor from a group of different researchers who had a different take. So I don't know how quite we found ourselves there, but it led to confusion because some people had clearly read the article and not the editorial, because the article is open access and the editorial is behind the paywall. I have actually tweeted BGSM and asked for it to be made open access so that everyone's got access to everything. I did speak to one person who'd read the editorial, wasn't aware of the paper, and the editorial clearly made little sense. So I don't know how we found ourselves in that interesting scenario, but perhaps it just makes sense if it's okay with you if I just summarize what the paper looked at and essentially what the conclusions and what the tweets were, and then we can pick into why if we take a deeper dive that things may not be as they first seem. Do you think, a reasonable way to go?
Absolutely, yeah, no, that's great.
Cool. So again, forgive me for looking down at my notes, but what we essentially had was, like I said, Dutch primary care setting, participants with plantar heel pain, 185 participants in the study, although only 176 completed follow-up. So pretty good numbers, I think we can agree. And they were randomized into one of 3 groups, which were sort of entitled sort of GP-led treatment, then podiatrist-issued custom-made orthoses, and podiatrist issued sham orthoses. So we've essentially got a group of individuals with all the same, condition, plantar heel pain, and they've been put into these 3 different groups. Lots of data. The primary outcome was pain severity after a 12-week period. And what they showed was that in the GP-led group, there was less pain at a 12-week period. And we'll go into that in a bit more depth in a minute. And therefore, the conclusions from this were interesting. You go into Twitter, and some of the tweets that I see, my favorite one being, "Is this the end of podiatry?" And as a podiatrist, that's kind of interesting to hear, given I've not been in clinic for 5 months, by the way, so I'm already pretty down on my luck. Is this the end for podiatry? Do GPs need to even refer heel pain to podiatrists? Are GPs the best people to see heel pain? Clearly orthoses have no place in treating heel pain, etc., etc. And when we then say, okay, can we get there from this paper? And we look at these 3 groups, and this is the way that sort of I did it when I critiqued it and I broke it down. I said, okay, let's take a look at them group by group. So what was the GP-led care? Now, a couple of interesting things, and it may speak to how advanced primary care, Dutch primary care is, of course. But in the GP-led group, or GP sort of led care group, they were giving biomechanical interventions, as they referred to, like silicone heel cups. They were giving corticosteroid injections. Absolutely worth noting that in that group, they had more face-to-face consultations. So there may be some contextual things there as well. Other thing I should have mentioned, by the way, all 3 groups were given education information on stretching, strengthening, the RAF lift loading protocol as well, all 3 groups. So I look at this, and speaking of where I work in the world, in the country, and I say, is that what GP care for heel pain looks like? It's certainly not necessarily my experience that that's what it looks like. But yeah, so are we really looking at GP-led care, or GP care here, or are we just looking at pretty good care, pretty broad care that, sure, considering lots of things? We go into the custom, or the custom and the sham group, the orthoses groups. 50 podiatrists were issuing these devices across this study, and they were writing the custom-made prescriptions at their discretion, which is really pragmatic, and it's the real world reflection of the real world. But actually what that really means when it comes down to it is we don't know what was issued. And ultimately, if we just say custom-made orthoses didn't work in this study, well, we're not just saying apples aren't tasty. We're saying, well, someone was given a Brayburn, someone was given a Granny Smith, someone was giving a Pink Lady. What do we really know about apples here? When it comes to the sham group, and my thoughts on whether a sham orthosis is even possible. Sure. It was made from a 3D mold of the foot, and they basically referred to it as being, as mechanically inert as they thought it could be. But once again, none of this was measured. We have absolutely no idea whether this device was mechanically inert or not, because it wasn't looked at. It certainly wasn't psychologically inert as well. I think we can probably agree. So, is the sham even a sham? Is the custom a custom? Yes, but we don't know what that means. Is the sham a sham? Probably not. And when you really take a second layer dive into it, you've got stats like 8% of the orthoses wearers in the study admitted to never wearing their orthoses. You've got little numbers like that when you really get into the depth of the study. So, and
that's admitted to, and we know that there's going to be always a group that we're always frustrated by the fact that there's then those that didn't admit to it.
Exactly right. I think I'm right in saying 58% said they wore their devices every day, which means that we've got 8% that never wore them, 58 that said they wore them every day, but probably some people in the middle as well. So
did the 8% get them ruled out?
We say okay.
Sorry, say again. There's a bit of a lag, mate. Sorry. Did the 8% then get ruled out, left out of the statistics? If they've admitted to not actually complying with the intervention, do they get declared as lost to follow-up as well?
That is a good question. I haven't delved properly into the stats in the last week, but again, we do have 170. Perhaps that's why we've got that discrepancy between 185 in the study and 176 completing. They may have been that attrition stat as well. Sure. I need to look. I need to check it. The honest answer is I'm not sure. So we look at the 3 groups and we say, are they reflective of GP care? Probably not. And also, by the way, what I really want to defend here is this isn't reflective of podiatry care. If you go to a podiatrist with plantar heel pain, we don't just dish out orthoses and say, see you later. That isn't what podiatry care looks like. So anyway, when you look at the sort of the stats, and I want to make sure I don't, I'm going to read this verbatim from the actual paper because it's important I don't get this wrong. When you look at the stats and the discussion, they looked at the differences. Yes, there was a statistical difference between the pain levels, meaning the GP group had less pain at 12 weeks. But I'm reading this verbatim, open quote. However, the differences found were small and did not reach clinical importance, end quote. So what we've got here is, the authors are saying, clinically speaking, there wasn't really any significant difference between these three groups, despite there being a statistical difference in the GP group being in slightly less pain. So clinically, are we getting a bit carried away here? We've essentially got three different groups that all did about the same. Now, the data here is mean pooled, meaning we do not know how individuals in the study or in any of the groups responded. We know that some will have probably done very well, some will have done not so well, and that will pull the mean somewhere into the middle. So again, when it comes to that scenario in clinic where we've got that n=1, case study sitting in front of us, are we any the wiser as to how we can work out what they may or may not respond to? The answer is probably not. And finally, and I want to make this kind of clear when we go into the editorial, and this was written by some podiatry legends really at La Trobe University in Melbourne. Professor Hilton Menz is the lead author, and a couple of other names that people will recognise. And again, I want to read this because I think this sums up things beautifully. Given that there was no statistic, that essentially there wasn't any clinical significance to the difference between the groups, here was what they said. Rather than concluding that treatment with custom insoles provides no additional value compared with usual GP care, it could be argued that the outcomes were similar between the groups, despite the GPs using a wider range of effective treatment options and seeing participants more frequently. So the GPs had more arrows in their quiver, they saw them more frequently, and they did get that much better than the people that were just given orthoses by a podiatrist and sent out the door. So I just don't know how anyone can tweet what they've been tweeting. I mean, to me, this is being framed as a GP versus podiatry thing. This isn't a GP versus podiatry thing. This isn't, to my mind, what GP care looks like. It's certainly not what podiatry care looks like. And you know what? What we know here is that there was some reasonable results across the groups. They all had education, strengthening, RAF lift loading. The GP group had things like heel cups, injections, face-to-face contact. There was custom-made orthoses, sham orthoses, but really what we're looking at is with the custom-made orthoses is a big barrel of apples of different brands. The sham orthoses are probably a big barrel of pears of different brands, conference pears, and I'm not smart enough to know another pair, but you get the idea. And what we know is that, essentially, if you have a relationship with a good podiatrist, that's what good podiatry care looks like. All of those things. So this framing of GP versus podiatrist is really confusing to me. I hate the idea, and I'm not sitting here as a podiatrist I'm not getting my knickers in a twist that this doesn't look good for podiatry or this doesn't look good for orthoses. You know my take on both of those things. I'm looking at this saying, the GP led and the podiatry led to me were irrelevant. They were clinicians leading different intervention groups. There wasn't a clinically significant difference between all of them. And I just don't think, I think if podiatry as a profession can ride out the coronavirus, then we can probably ride out this study.
I think one of the accusation will be that that your defence is out of defence. It's that, and similarly the editorial. And so, with my devil's advocacy hat on, do you feel like it's always hard to know where your opinions and emotions sometimes come from in terms of their it's only when you hear them out and hear about a plethora of different reasons as to why some of the conclusions were rash. But in this instance, do you feel that you're frustrated? What frustrates you more, I think, is my question. Like, is it the conclusion? I doubt, knowing you, or is it the abuse and spin of the mishaps that seem to have occurred within the science, especially the method of disseminating that science seems a bit unusual. But then also, is it the spin? Like, where's your biggest beef if you had to point to it?
I think for me, it's people misinterpreting what good what podiatry care is, what a podiatrist is, and what they do. You know, you come and see a podiatrist with plantar heel pain, and the only tool in their toolbox are orthoses, and they're going to be dished at you indiscriminately, and then you may or may not get followed up, and you may or may not do well. The idea of people considering that is what podiatric care in 2020 looks like is definitely upsetting to me. As you know, I'm actually incredibly passionate about my profession, would defend it to the death. I'm not that worried about how orthoses come out of a study looking like, whether they look favourable or unfavourable. I don't have a badger in that bag. I actually give far fewer than many people expect. I'm a pretty minimal intervener in that regard. But when we look at sort of what the GP group got, you know, silicone heel cups, loading protocols, you know, education, face-to-face contact, that is essentially what podiatry care looks like on a daily basis, in my world at least.
What I would say is that, of course, I agree with all of that, but then I worry that, and you maybe don't like me saying this, but I would argue that you're still unrepresentative to some extent. And the reason that those assumptions sometimes underlie these things is because people sometimes make those associations because they haven't necessarily met you or your ilk in the profession, and sometimes their podiatric colleagues are sometimes indiscriminately. It is a punt with a pair of often carbon fiber shiny and sometimes rather expensive insoles, and that's how they described us. And of course, I use that term to make you flinch. But you know what I think it doesn't excuse any of the behaviour, but I'm just thinking that's a variable.
Yeah, I think that's valid. I've in the last week across various fora and discussion groups and colleagues and things, this paper's been talked about a lot. The majority of people are pretty miffed about podiatry being aligned with just being orthoses disher outers, you know. But I'm conscious that I have echo chambers, and the colleagues I speak to and the people I surround myself with would probably over the years have become of similar mindsets as well. I haven't seen too many people push back because from a defensive perspective of, okay, I make my living by giving foot orthoses and this threatens that, but I'm not going to pretend that they are those people aren't out there. I'm sure they probably are, but they don't seem to be the groups I hang around in. The other thing, of course, is how, you know, just how do we, and this could be any paper we're talking about. Obviously, I'm biased because this is a podiatric/orthoses paper, but how do we look at these data and look at the context and the limitations of such a study and get to a point where some of us are tweeting or retweeting the things that have been retweeted? I mean, I just don't know how that translation is so off. And again, it's clear to me some of the tweets I was looking at are people that haven't read this paper properly, or they have read it and they haven't perhaps understood it, or perhaps they weren't even aware it existed, but they saw a tweet, it fit their narrative, so they just retweeted it again. And that's all fine. We all do that. But like I say, if we're really going to be evidence-based or evidence-informed as clinicians, whether we're podiatrists, physios, if we are going to stand, you know, live and die on the evidence-based hill, like, we need to learn how to read these papers, critique them, and consider the conclusions in the context of what was done. And by the way, this is not the author's fault. This is actually a very, very nicely designed paper. The authors are very clear about what their data, these data show and don't show. This isn't an author. This isn't a research. This is the research comes out, and to my mind, it's then, you know, getting from research to clinical practice coalface. Like there seems to be a bit of a discourse.
So we've got professionals succumbing to a clickbait culture in many ways, and then sometimes ramping that up rather than actually offering the context and nuance that a professional filter you would hope would do, especially when it comes to these interventions being, you know, this is, especially when passed out, valuable data for us to clinically reason with and to comprehend how that might influence our care delivery. It poses more questions than answers, as most decent pieces of work do. However, what do you think are the variables that are making us continue to be sucked in and succumb to a clickbait culture?
I mean, put it this way, I've got an interest in research. I like reading research. I've done a bit. Like a pseudo researcher. It's hard. It's tricky. It's difficult. It's difficult to do. It's time consuming. Reading it is tricky. You have to be able to source it. I mean, luckily this original article was open access, but if you don't have a BJSM sort of subscription, usually you got to actually, somehow get your hands on the paper, then find time in your life to read it, source it. There's one hurdle, time to read it. But then you got to, I've read this thing 3 or 4 times, and already I've shown that you asked me a question and I didn't know the answer about it. I don't fully, I need to take a couple of more laps around this paper. I've got a system I use where the first thing I do is I look through and I look at, like, okay, what were the 3 groups? Are they what they said they were? I'd probably need a couple more, runs through this paper to really get hold of it. So it's not just time to read it once. It's the time and the energy, and I guess the passion to read it 4 or 5 times. And even then, I'm not versed enough to say that I'm going to fully understand the statistics. I'm going to have to speak to a friend or a colleague who does. All of those are hurdles. And in the time that I have even badly explained that to you, I could have sent 3 tweets. So this is where we find ourselves in this 21st century of I think I sent out a sarcastic tweet saying, are we actually just in this for the likes and the shares, or do we want to
that's what I think I can't, and you've described to fully comprehend and digest it, of course, exists. The reason why I've passed comments, right? It's that people won't hold judgment, or they won't this looks in not to it yet, but interesting conclusions, or it's that it's almost like a pre-spin, and you could sort of infer then hold, but the fact that it's heavy conclusions being put is fascinating. I find it really interesting, just a symptom of society, even invested in interventions and care. I think it's really. What I want as well with regards to the care delivery of patients with pain, it's actually not a condition in which I strongly associate with that. Naturally, I don't associate it with other injuries, presentation with orthoses. Is that me? A primary intervention?
Yes, it's an interesting question, because we see an awful lot of it. But like I say, I don't know that if someone's got heel pain, podiatrists are necessarily the first people that they would consider seeing. They would probably go to their GP. I'm not suggesting we need to see all of it as a first line, but we do see an awful lot. It's probably the highest percentage of things we see. Are orthoses things that the majority of us do, as a first line intervention, clinically, from my own clinical sort of practice? Probably not. A lot of the things that, ironically, in that GP-led group were done are definitely things that I would usually do first. We've actually, I am a very small part of a bigger research group who actually have a best practice guide for plantar heel pain currently under peer review. And what we did was we did a systematic review of the literature. We also did some sort of interviews of world leading experts, and we also got the patient perspective. So those kind of 3 pillars: the evidence, the clinicians, and the actual patient voice, and brought it together. You've seen one, I'm sure, for patellofemoral pain, that best practice guide for patellofemoral pain. Yeah. But we've got a plantar heel pain one under review. So without giving the game away, hopefully that will see the light of day fairly soon, and it will show us, okay, what does the evidence tell us? What do the patients think works? What are the experts that see heel pain every single day? What do they believe works? And then how do we sort of synthesize all that together? But it's not something the orthoses aren't something I personally reach for that early on.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I've got a question here from Derek Griffin, who. You won't be able to see the whole question here on screen, but I'll read it out for you. Hi all, I have a question. Take strength training of plantar heel pain. The evidence is weak, especially in the long term, and hasn't really shown to be superior to doing nothing, has anything. Yet we are very happy to consider it as good care and intervention despite a lack of data. Do we pick and choose the studies to critique? I think it's an interesting point in a few ways. And one thing I want to highlight is that for those that are just joining, Derek's mentioning the fact that we were saying that the sort of strength and stretch interventions that were almost a standard across the groups was almost assumed to be best practice in a way. Do you think that's fair, what Dale's asking and saying?
I think that's a great point. And I should also add that in certain circles, certainly the ones I'm in, the strength paper for plantar heel pain, the Rathliff approach, critiqued an awful lot. Strength seems to be sexy, everyone's talking about, you can't go wrong getting strong. I mean, I'm a podiatrist. I hear, that's trickled down into our profession from physiotherapy. But Derek's absolutely right. The data for strength work in plantar heel pain is lacking. To go back to our paper that's under peer review, when we did the systematic review of all the interventions, so we had to look at orthoses, injections, shockwave. What you'll see, hopefully, when it gets published, is that strength work doesn't feature. Firstly, because there just isn't that much work published. But secondly, the work that is published wasn't of a high enough quality, and this includes the Rathliff paper, to be included in the systematic review. Yet, when we asked a lot of the experts, what are you doing? What do you think works? There was a heavy voice that strength work is king. So the data and what the clinicians are doing, there seems to have a discrepancy there. It doesn't mean that strength work isn't best practice. It might just mean that the data hasn't yet caught up. It may well mean people are doing it because it fits their bias. But Derek's absolutely right. We need to critique everything with the same viewpoint, whether it's orthoses, whether it's strength work, whether it's shockwave, whether it's injections. And I promise you, we are just as critical of strength being the panacea for everything, which we don't believe it is, as we are orthoses being that.
People are sometimes, and particularly in that paper, people were interested in its novelty, but also the mechanism of effect and the mechanism of inferred load distribution. Something that hadn't done, not a massive physics-based workup that I imagine knowing you like in your physics. I think you'd have almost liked that pre-work with regards to what was being inferred as to the mechanism of transmission of force and stuff. There could have been more done in that direction rather than just theory. But Derek, I'd second what Ian's saying there in terms of my agreement is that, I don't think you'd get us to waving through strength work as if it's something that should be just taken for granted as being a force for good, excuse the pun. But similarly, I do also agree, Derek, that I see that happening. I do see that assumption. It's interesting that comes through on your work, Ian. I'm going to have to say, you don't mind once that's published that you're going to come on this show and any other show that we're attached to in order to talk about that? Can I get you on the hook for that on air?
The best practice guide. Yeah, happy to. I'm a very small part. I could probably get a smarter person who did more work on the actual project on for you instead. They'd be superior to me. But if they're too busy, I'm happy to be.
We'll get them on, and you can just be shining the shoes in the background. We'll do something like that. But yeah, thanks so much for your time. I did mention we're coming up to time, and I've always been trying to keep these to half an hour. So we will wrap up. But one of the things that I'm going to be talking about tomorrow is that it's sort of rattled on a little bit on Twitter. Greg Lehman and strength and conditioning coach, I think he's called Mike Boyd or something like that, had started to have a back and forth whereby it was sort of strength and conditioning coach inferring that a lot of people he sees out running shouldn't be running, they should be walking instead because it's just fast limping. And Greg sort of somewhat outraged by that because he's someone that doesn't think that those biomechanical things that he's viewing are necessarily faults as much as he might do. And they've had a back and forth that's not been pleasant, but it's been great to watch. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that, not just the spat, but also how important is it? What can we deduce from running form, and how judgmental should we be of someone on the street that's trying to get fit? Really, I think that's another question societally. But you've got away without me throwing that to you, Ian, because we're out of time. But feel free to join on the comments tomorrow, no doubt. But thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Where can people find out more about you? What are your social media handles?
So I am sports_pod on Twitter and sports podiatry info on Instagram.
And you've got your own podcast, Run Chat Live. No. Pod Chat Live.
Pod Chat Live.
That was rude.
Run Chat Live's the one that copied us.
I'll plug Run Chat Live as well. So we love Matt Phillips. But sorry, Pod Chat Live is a great show. Not dissimilar to this one in terms of its streaming, etc. So join Craig and Ian for that as well. So thanks a lot as ever for your time, mate. It's been really interesting. No doubt the discussion will roll on, and we'll link to the paper for those that are asking for it.
Thanks, mate.
No, just my fancy outro to go. Hope you're all well. I'll speak to you tomorrow.